Good evening. Thanks for joining. My name is James Teeter. I am with the Build a Better Bend board, and I'm so excited you all are here. Thank you very much. Build a Better Bend has been an organization, a nonprofit for about 20 years now, and our mission is to bring speakers to our community so that we can learn and affect development in a positive way from how people do things in other places. A lot of our board members are here in the room. If you don't mind raising your hand or stand up. I'm so proud to work with you all. You're a blessing. Thank you. I believe we also have a few elected officials here tonight. If you don't mind also raising your hand or standing up. Thank you all for the work you do. These lectures would not be possible without our supporters, and when we envisioned a three-part lecture on the widely debated topic of housing, we were very fortunate that two of our most prominent developers here, Polish and Hayden, wanted to partner together to sponsor this entire series, and we thank you for that. I have the pleasure of introducing Deborah Flagan, the VP of Community Engagement and Giving at Hayden Homes. Deborah?
Thank you, James. My name is Deb Flagan, Vice President of Hayden Homes, and I'm very excited to be here. When I learned that Gregg was going to be coming, I think that I couldn't respond fast enough because I was so excited that we were going to have an opportunity to sponsor. Tonight, I want to tell you how proud I am to co-sponsor this with our colleagues and friends at Polish Homes. Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little story about how I became a de facto distributor of Gregg's book. I think I've given about 35 copies to many leaders, maybe in this room and across the state. In November of 2019, I was invited by our state representative, Sherry Holt, to attend a meeting. And she asked if I would come to learn about our veterans. And that is actually the meeting right there. It was our county commissioners and many of our city officials. Thank you, Barb. And we learned about creating a veterans village. 6 months later, COVID hit, and all of our volunteers were not able to contribute because of the social distancing. And so quickly, the building community rallied around to figure out how we could build this village. And that picture right at the top there is Eric Tobiasen, who is our leader, and that is half of the Polish staff and half of the Hayden Home staff coming together to work on this village. Here's what I learned through this veteran village process. I learned that I didn't know very much about homelessness, and I read many, many books. And this book continued to rise to the top. I think I even mentioned it or quoted Gregg at one of the city council meetings, if I remember correctly. And I also realized that homelessness is not partisan. It takes people from both sides of the aisle, and that's exactly what happened in this situation with Veterans Village. It also takes a community, and that's what happened with the building community, and we all have to come together to fix this solution. So I'm grateful to be here today and really happy to have Gregg visiting. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. We're also very fortunate to have my employer, Ashley and Vance, sponsoring tonight's lecture. Ashley and Vance Engineering is a community of talented civil and structural engineers on a mission to change the world by doing things a little differently. And I can attest to that. But thank you, Ashley and Vance. If we could give you a round of applause, I appreciate it. and I have a lot of sponsors to name here. If you hear your organization, if you don't mind giving a little hoot. Our supporting sponsors include Central Oregon Land Watch, Miller Lumber, Cascadia Partners, Killian Pacific, and Skirsa Group. You know. Additionally, we have a very long list of partners for this series. We have Project and Walker Macy, Eco Northwest, Palmer Homes, DKS Associates, Dowell, Kittleson Associates, CEA Consulting Engineers, Kelcon, SunWest Builders, CYC, Hand in Hand Productions, who is recording this tonight. You can share it with your friends later. Stemish Design and Architect, Tenover Studio, KPFF, First Interstate Bank, and LRS Architects. Thank you all so much. See, this is the first in a three-part lecture series on housing. We have more discussions coming up about the barriers to development, the lack of middle-income housing, and even NIMBYism culture. The housing crisis is real, and it impacts Central Oregonians every day. Tonight, we are excited to have Dr. Gregg Colburn with us to guide us through this complex issue. Dr. Colburn is an associate professor at the Runstad Department of Real Estate at the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. He publishes research on topics related to housing, homelessness, and is co-author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. His research has been featured in leading media outlets, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and National Public Radio. At the University of Washington, Gregg teaches classes about housing, urban economics, and finance. Gregg serves as the co-chair of University of Washington's Homelessness Research Initiative and is a member of the National Alliance to End Houselessness Research Council. And I can attest, Gregg is an extremely warm individual, and I'm in awe to be in his presence. So if you don't mind, please help me welcome Dr. Gregg Colburn.
Thank you, James. It's good to be in Bend, Central Oregon. This is my first trip here. Had a chance to take a little walk and see downtown with James. Deborah, thanks for your comments and advocacy for the book. I appreciate it. I feel a little bit like a rock star, like, hello, Cleveland. Like, I'm trying to remember which city I'm in. I did have a moment today. I'm like, where am I today? I have gone through kind of this emotional roller coaster on this because I haven't written a book before and moved to Seattle in 2017. My first career was in finance. I was an investment banker and private equity person, and so I have a market. I was kind of raised in the markets, professionally speaking. And I moved to Seattle and because I study housing, got involved in all sorts of community conversations around housing and homelessness, and I would just sit quietly because I was the newcomer saying, like, we have no idea what's going on. We all agreed that there was a big problem, but there was no understanding of what was driving this. And so I was working with a friend of mine at the Gates Foundation who was leading their homelessness investments, and we were out one day, and I just said, I feel like I want to write a book about this. And he's like, I think you should. And so here it is. And what's interesting is I kind of describe this book as a translational. It's the least rigorous thing I've done in my academic work. I actually wrote that in my tenure dossier to the president of the University of Washington. So we write all these fancy journal articles that only other professors read, and they have all sorts of fancy math. And then this is, a 10th grade stat student could do the math in this book. And so the funny part of that, I was giving a talk at Harvard, and there were a bunch of students and professors around, and they said, well, talk about the analysis. And I said, well, I wrote in my tenure package that this was the least rigorous thing that I'd ever done. And this professor at Harvard said, you said that? And I said, yeah, I did. And they gave me tenure, so it was amazing. Maybe not at Harvard, but they did at UW. But I think the idea here is that we've known a lot of this information for some time, but it hasn't filtered into the general population. And if we're going to make meaningful change here, I fundamentally think that the narrative around this needs to change. And so this is our modest contribution to that. I didn't know that if anyone would read the book. I knew my parents would. And even my wife read drafts, so she was great. So I'm floored, actually, that people are reading it. It's, selfishly, it's rewarding. It feels good to have people reading it. The highlight was our daughter's in college. Her academic calendar's weird. She was home from Thanksgiving to New Year's. And so she was home before a lot of her friends were back from college. And so she was a little bored. And I came home one day, and she was in the living room reading the book. And I was like, what's going on? She's like, well, I was bored. My friends aren't home. I thought I would read it. I'm like, well, what did you think? She's like, it's really not bad. I'm like, okay, well, we'll take that from a 19-year-old any day. So anyway, I appreciate you coming out tonight. As I said, I've been kind of on this emotional roller coaster where it was, really fun to go to all these cities and talk about the books. People are interested. And it's gotten to the point where I'm now getting a little concerned in the sense that I'll give a talk and someone will come up and say, we are really struggling with this. So I gave a talk in New York a couple weeks ago, and this fellow came up afterwards. He said, I'm the mayor of Salem, Massachusetts. Is there any way you could come out in the next couple weeks? I'm like, I'm booked for the next 3 months. And it's just an evidence of how this issue is creeping into every community in the United States. Ames, Iowa, Des Moines. I was just in Lawrence, Kansas, Kansas City. Like all these places you wouldn't think that homelessness is a big issue, and they're fighting it. So it's not just Seattle, San Francisco, and LA, although those are certainly major hotspots for this issue. It's all over the place. And the other dynamic that's been interesting is coming to communities like Bend, hospitality, recreation-driven communities that are affluent, that are drawing people in. And so I'm going to Sun Valley in a couple weeks. I've been to Asheville, North Carolina. I'm going to Santa Fe, cities with similar dynamics that are saying like, holy crap, we have a problem. And so you are in good company or bad company, depending on how you want to look at it. But in other words, this dynamic's happening in a lot of places. So the idea, the motivation is public narrative around homelessness in my community in Seattle was screwed up. And it was driven by our experiences on 3rd Avenue walking by Joe, and there's a needle next to Joe, and it's like, well, obviously this is a drug problem. And if you read the Seattle Times every day, you would reach that conclusion. I've actually been butting heads with journalists a lot recently. Like, you're not helping. You're not helping. You're selling papers, but you're not helping. And so we need to understand, and it's not that Joe isn't important, it's not that addiction and mental health aren't important, we need to understand the context in which life circumstance happens. That's the fundamental issue here. All right, that's the book. So if we're gonna talk about homelessness and write a book about homelessness, we need to understand causation. And so for those of you who've gone to grad school, in the social sciences, we teach all sorts of classes around causation. And they're really hard classes because understanding social phenomena are really difficult because human beings are complex. And I've never experienced homelessness. I've never even experienced housing insecurity. But I've talked to a whole bunch of people who have. And I will tell you, every story is unique. And so I'm not going to stand up here and say, here's the one pathway into homelessness, because that would be totally incorrect and disingenuous. Okay. And the other challenge is there's all sorts of different ways of knowing. One of the ways of knowing is we ask people, why are you homeless? Tell us about your experiences of homelessness. And one of the ways we do that is in January when we conduct the point in time count. Every jurisdiction in the United States creates an estimate of the homeless population. And as part of that, it's walking around at night and you're looking for people. I first did this in Minneapolis. Imagine January 25th, walking around outside Minneapolis, right? Really puts things in perspective. We also then will ask people, we'll do surveys and ask them about their experiences. And they tell us very honestly and bluntly what's going on in their lives. My boyfriend beat me up and I ran. I'm homeless. Okay. I made some poor choices. I drink too much. I lost my job, got in a fight with my roommate. Now I'm homeless. And so we honor these explanations and we publish them. The Seattle Times gets a hold of them and says, here are the causes of homelessness. And when the Seattle Times write that, I kind of sit in my office going, Of course divorce can be a cause of homelessness. But if my wife and I hope it doesn't happen, got divorced tomorrow, neither of us would be homeless. So the context in which these things happen really, really matters. Okay? So one of the challenges I had in writing the book is I knew I wanted to center housing. So here comes Gregg, former investment banker, saying it's the housing market, and here's a woman next to me saying it's domestic violence. Who am I to say that that's not the truth? So the point is that we need to understand the individual and structural drivers and honor both of them. This is the truth, and we need to understand that. We also need to understand the context in which that happens. So the way that we highlight in the book is drawing a distinction between what we call precipitating events and root causes. Sorry, I feel like I'm way up here looking down at you. But, and so the idea is not to draw a distinction because one is right and one is wrong. They're both right, but they lead us to different understandings. And the way that we do this in the book is to highlight, is to use this metaphor analogy of musical chairs. Okay. So imagine 10 friends get together to play a game of musical chairs. There are 10 chairs in a circle. There's a leader. The leader starts playing music. Everyone starts walking around in a circle. At some point, the leader takes one chair out, so we now have 9 chairs and 10 people. Leader stops the music. Everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. In this case, it was Mike, who had sprained his ankle and was on crutches. Wasn't able to move quickly when the music stopped. And so I'm a big sports fan. If ESPN were there filming the sporting event, which is what we do when someone loses, like, why did you lose? Tell us about your experience. What would you say? I lost because I had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod. Yes, this was the cause. If you think about it as a causation thing, that caused me to lose the game. And everyone would nod. There wouldn't be much dispute about that. But if we ask a different question and say, why didn't you have a chair? The answer is because we didn't have 10 chairs. Okay? So this is exactly what's happening in Seattle and San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles and Boston and DC right now, which is when housing is scarce, someone's going to lose. And who loses? People who are vulnerable. People who are physically disabled, people who are old, people who are poor, people who are addicted, people who have been discriminated against, whatever the case may be. And then we see Joe on the street and we say, of course Joe's homeless, he's addicted. Of course Joe lost the game, he has a bad ankle. And what we're missing in that brief analysis and encounter on 3rd Avenue is the structural deficit of housing that is creating the conditions that allow Joe to be on the street. It's not to say that his addiction isn't important and doesn't deserve treatment. Of course it does. But we need to understand why this is happening at such high levels in our coastal cities and not in other places. That's the point of the book. I've learned when you write a book about homelessness that you get lots of angry emails. Okay? And I went from kind of being irritated by them to now drawing some pleasure in them. I actually have a folder in my inbox for these emails. 4-letter words, I mean, it's amazing how now the elected leaders in the room probably aren't surprised by this. But I never got people swearing at me in emails before. And this is causing people to do that, which is, could actually write a second book about the reaction to that, because it's like, what does this say about us? So here's the deal. So if at some point your blood pressure starts to rise during this talk, you're in good company. Please don't leave and say Gregg doesn't think drug use and abuse isn't a problem. That's not the point of this book. Okay? If you're addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're poor, you are more likely to experience homelessness. No doubt, it's an individual cause of homelessness. But we also know those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts and not others, so we should want to understand that. So the question we pose in the book is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does San Francisco have 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago? Okay, massive, massive variation. Is it simply because Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle have more people with individual risk factors? If drug use, mental illness, and poverty cause homelessness, if you have more people with those conditions, you should have more homelessness. From a logic perspective, that's a very sound argument. It turns out to be entirely false. Entirely false. Doesn't stop people from making the argument, by the way. Including Trump's Council of Economic Advisors made that argument in their report on homelessness, which we cite in the book. It's not true. So it's a book about cities, not about people. And what I want to stress is that person-focused research is super important. That's not this book, though. This is to explain what the heck is going on in Seattle and other cities like it. And the thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at high levels. And these individual factors that receive disproportionate time and attention is really a sorting mechanism. It identifies the people who are going to lose their housing when housing is scarce. Okay, so if I'm going to write a book about regional variation in rates of homelessness, I want to demonstrate for you that, in fact, there is large variation. The sample in the book is roughly the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. Okay, and we can talk in the Q&A a little bit about generalizability. Does this apply to Bend? I think it does. Does it apply to rural contexts? Maybe, maybe not. There's a bureaucratic nuance here, which is some places count homelessness at the city level, just within the boundaries of the city. Other places count at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong. It's just a bureaucratic nuance. The implication, though, is that county-based, they're called COCs, for those of you who are in the field. County-based COCs generally will have lower per capita rates of homelessness because you're including suburban locations where homelessness is less prevalent. So what we can't do is compare counties to cities in terms of rates of homelessness. It doesn't stop journalists from doing this all the time. They'll say, look at, San Francisco has way more homelessness than Los Angeles County. On a per capita basis, that's true, but we're comparing apples to oranges. So what we need to do is compare cities to cities. When we do that, we see New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are just shy of 10 per 1,000 people, 10 homeless people per 1,000. And that's about 5 times Indianapolis, which is about 2. I'm sorry, sir, you have the worst seat in the house here. Yeah. We have a massage therapist in the back for you. In counties, the numbers are lower. But what's interesting, and I didn't realize this until I ran the numbers, the relationship is still 5 to 1. LA County, Santa Clara, King, which is Seattle, Multnomah, which you know is Portland, is about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. So this is massive variation. Massive, not 20%, 30%, 5 times. So the purpose of the book is to explain this variation. Okay? And if we can explain this variation, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of this crisis and therefore allow us to focus time, attention, and resources there, as opposed to all these other things that we're playing whack-a-mole with right now. Okay, so the logic of the book is we're going to take all the conventional explanations for homelessness, test and see, using really simple math, does it help us understand regional variation? Does it help us understand this question? If it doesn't, we cross it off, we move to the next one. Okay? And so I don't go through all of them here, but I will go through some just to give you a flavor of the logic of the argument. Okay, so you're going to see a few of these. So just to orient you, if you haven't looked at a graph like this in a while. So the x-axis, the bottom axis here in this case is the poverty rate. That would be the percentage of people in that community, in that jurisdiction, that are below the federal poverty line. So high poverty, low poverty. Our y-axis here is rates of homelessness, high homelessness, low homelessness. This is every city or every jurisdiction in the sample between 2007 and 2019. 2007 is when we started counting homelessness in the United States. And the line in the middle is just a regression line showing the relationship. The closer that R squared gets to 1, it's a more powerful relationship. As that gets closer to 0, it's nothing. It's just dots on a page. So this one, actually, there's a modest statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what you would expect. Okay? Places with really, really high rates of poverty have lower rates of homelessness, which is a head scratcher because I just told you that poverty causes homelessness. Of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. It's a fundamental poverty problem. But homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not amidst poverty. That's the point of this slide. And it doesn't mean that poverty isn't a problem. The point of this slide is that being poor in Seattle has very different consequences than being poor in Chicago. Okay? We can't blame the problem in Seattle on disproportionate numbers of poor people. In fact, we have fewer poor people in Seattle than in Cleveland or Detroit or St. Louis or Baltimore. Okay? So we can't blame poverty. And this is where blood pressure starts to rise for people. Okay? Serious mental illness. The drug and mental illness data are better at the state level. So this is every state in the nation. It's their rate of serious mental illness graphed against state rates of homelessness. And what you'll see is basically no relationship. Again, this doesn't mean that mental illness isn't important, that it doesn't deserve treatment. I think we have an obligation to provide treatment. The point is that there are people experiencing serious mental illness in every state in the nation with some variation, and that variation bears 0 relationship to rates of homelessness. It is not that we have disproportionate numbers of mentally ill people in California and Oregon and Washington and Massachusetts that's explaining our homelessness problem. What this says is that the consequences of mental illness might be very different in Oregon than in Illinois, for example. Okay? Same story with drugs. This is substance use disorders. R squared of 0.06 is basically nothing. Okay? There are people using and abusing drugs in every state in the nation at varying rates, and it bears 0 relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay? And so when people send me a note and say, well, of course this is a drug problem. I just saw Joe on the street and there was a needle next to him. I was like, of course, drugs is certainly part of the story here. It's helping to identify the people who are going to lose housing. The Amazon people are going to get housing. The addicts in Seattle probably aren't. And then we see them on the street. The other point that's super, super important in this conversation around mental illness and drug use is the causal arrow clearly goes in one direction, which is if you're addicted or mentally ill, you're more likely to experience homelessness. There's a causal relationship there. But we also know from lots of research that the causal arrow goes in the other direction, which means experiencing homelessness is super traumatic. The research on this is brutal people experience physical and sexual assault at crazy high levels. They're not eating, they're not sleeping, they're not getting fed, they're not getting medical care. And then we're surprised that they develop behavioral health disorders? Okay. This is an obvious response to trauma. And so what I say to people is by not housing people, we are creating and exacerbating our behavioral health crisis. So when we see Joe on the street, we don't know if his addiction caused his homelessness or as a consequence. Okay? And I say this not as a joke. If I were living on the streets in Seattle, I would medicate. And it wouldn't be the red wine, which I'm hopefully going to have later this evening. Okay? So it's really profound because it's so easy for us all to just make that logical connection. Margot Kushel is at the University of California, San Francisco. They just did an amazing study of homelessness in the state of California. She's an MD. She studies homelessness, but she's a medical doctor. They interviewed thousands of people in this study, and they actually asked them, like, why are you using drugs? Is there an instrumental purpose to your drug use? And what was interesting is meth is a big deal in California. I didn't know any of this until Margot told me. They would ask people, why are you using meth? And they said, for two reasons. One is meth suppresses my appetite, and I can't find food, and it's brutal to go through the day hungry. And so meth takes that away. The second thing it does for me is it helps me stay awake. Bad things happen when I fall asleep. And so we walk by Joe and we say, look at Joe, what a loser, he's a meth addict. He's actually using meth potentially for a reason to help him get through the day. So this is super, super complicated, and it's just so easy for us to draw simple conclusions when we actually learn about this. It's super tragic. It's hard to even talk about. Right? So we can't blame our problems in Seattle and San Francisco and Portland on disproportionate drug use or mental illness, although we are creating more of it every day by not housing folks. Race. So Black, brown, indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population, 3 to 4 times at a national level. And what's interesting, though, is when you plot the demographic makeup of cities and counties, in this case, the percentage of the population that's Black or African American, what you'll see is no relationship, which is a little weird because we know that this is a racial justice issue. It clearly is. So how do I explain this graph? The way I explain this graph is that race doesn't cause homelessness. If the demographic makeup of your community caused homelessness, Chicago should have lots more homelessness than Seattle. Much higher Black population in Chicago than Seattle, which is disproportionately white. The point of this is that racism causes homelessness. Racism helps to determine who in a community is more likely to experience homelessness. Racism explains why Black, brown, indigenous people are overrepresented in Seattle and in Chicago and every community in the United States. And this is through multiple sectors. Housing, criminal justice, education, healthcare, for generation after generation after generation produces these outcomes. So we need to focus on race and racism in our work, but it's not just the demographic makeup of a city that predicts it. So this doesn't help us explain the Seattle-Chicago conundrum. None of these did. So we have to cross these off and keep looking. So let's go to local context. This is what I call the cocktail party conversations around homelessness. Greg, LA has a lot of homelessness because it's warm. Chicago's cold, end of story. Have you heard this one? Okay. I joke if I had a nickel for every time I heard this, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd have a lot of nickels. Okay. We count homelessness in January. If you look at January temperature, what you'll see is there's cold places and warm places in the United States, and it bears zero relationship to rates of homelessness. Boston and New York are cold in January, tons of homelessness. There are places in Florida and Texas and Arizona that are very warm in January that don't have lots of homelessness. Okay? So we can't blame Mother Nature. For those of you astute readers and listeners to this, you might say, but we see a lot more visible homelessness in places that are warm. East Coast cities have built very robust shelter systems that shelter about 95% of their homeless population. So the visible manifestation of homelessness is less in colder places. And part of the reason for building that shelter might be to save lives. Okay. West Coast jurisdictions from Seattle all the way down to LA have much more limited shelter capacity. Let's say anywhere between 40 and 60% of people experiencing homelessness are sheltered. Therefore, we see a lot more people on the West Coast who are experiencing homelessness. That does correlate more with weather. But in terms of total homelessness, which is what I care about, which is sheltered plus unsheltered, there's no relationship. Well, you probably didn't because you have lives. But I listened to the Supreme Court I listened to the Supreme Court deliberations on the Grants Pass case, which we can talk about a little bit more given that we're in Oregon right now. And what was interesting is at one point, one of the justices asked, he's like, well, once we get them into shelter, they're not homeless. And the council had to say, no. If you're in shelter, we're just recharacterizing it from sheltered to from unsheltered to sheltered. And so it was like this light bulb moment for the justices who didn't realize that just creating homeless shelters doesn't end homelessness. It moves it from outdoors to indoors, and there's some utility in that, and there's a role for shelter, but it doesn't end homelessness. Okay, Greg, if we weren't so generous, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. Okay? I heard this first in Minneapolis when I was working on my PhD. People were blaming folks from Chicago for Minneapolis' homelessness problem. I moved to Seattle, first meeting, we're very generous, that's why we have homelessness. It's like, that's what Minneapolis said. Okay. LA, well, we're a magnet for homelessness. And it's funny because people blame Californians in Seattle for homelessness, and then I went to California, they said, well, the people are moving here. I said, you can't, you're moving your people to Seattle. And so LA people blame folks from Texas. Okay, and we write about Middletown, Ohio in the book, who believes they're a magnet for homelessness because of their incredible generosity. Middletown, Ohio. Okay, so this is a super prevalent narrative. I'm not a physicist, but this is not how magnets work. Everyone can't be the recipient. Okay? So this is TANF. The primary federal welfare program in the United States is TANF. If you just hear the term colloquially, welfare, this is what we're talking about. TANF came into being in 1996 under Clinton's welfare reform. One of the attributes or detriments, depending on how you look at it, is it delegates decision-making to states. States can determine the relative generosity of their TANF program. So you have stingy states, you have generous states. So we can test and see, do generous states attract more homelessness? And what you'll see is there's no relationship. Doesn't mean that generous benefits are bad. I'm actually in support of generous benefits. But we don't see people moving to generous states. Why? Moving is hard. That's the punchline. Residential mobility is actually quite high among low-income households because they tend to be renters and leases are 1 year and we see a lot of cycling, but it tends to be localized mobility. State-to-state mobility falls with income. Why? Because moving from state to state is hard. We moved a family of 4 from Minneapolis to Seattle in 2017, 2 middle schoolers, and it sucked. Okay, not a scientific term, right? We were leaving people who loved and cared for us in Minneapolis, new job, no friends, new schools for the kids. We had to find housing in Seattle, which was a nightmare. Okay? And we had every advantage under the sun. And now when I hear people in Seattle say, why don't they just move? I'll say, well, where and how? It was hard with every advantage under the sun, and now if your mom's the only one who's going to take care of your kids in Seattle, and you're going to move to Topeka, Kansas, no chance. No chance. These social networks become incredibly important for all of us, really important if you don't have a lot of resources. So we can't blame this mobility argument. Politics. Governor Newsom of California and President Trump, when he was in office, got in a big fight about this. President Trump said, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA are run by Democrats. True. Seattle, San Francisco, and LA have lots of homelessness. Also true. Therefore, Governor Newsom didn't like this argument very much. So they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the point here is that, and Democrats don't get a pass. We're going to talk about this a little bit. But the simple narrative permissive policies of local Democrats in West Coast cities causing homelessness doesn't hold up. Why? Because Democrats basically run every city in the United States, with a couple of exceptions. Okay? Miami, San Diego, Indianapolis briefly have had Republican mayors. Otherwise, it's Democrats. So if Democrats are to blame, why didn't Democrats produce a massive homelessness crisis in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, which have been run by Democrats for forever? Again, simple narrative that doesn't hold up. Now, where I say the Democrats don't get a free pass is Democrats have been in charge in West Coast states as these states have boomed. And I think one of the legacies of mayors and governors in these states is a housing crisis. I recently met with Governor Inslee, who is finishing up his 3rd term as governor of Washington. And I think he's recognizing that one of the things that he's going to have to account for when he leaves office is a massive housing crisis. And I don't know if you listen or read Ezra Klein, New York Times, but he's done a lot of really interesting research on, or not research, but just discussions around how have these supposedly progressive cities screwed this up so badly? And so we really need to think of, and we're going to talk about housing supply in a sense that Democrats, especially in Western states, have not done a great job of accommodating the growth that has come. And we're living with the consequences. And Joe on the street is primarily suffering as a result of these decisions. Okay, as you may have guessed, none of those are very good explanations. This is rent, median contract rent, and what you'll see is where rents are high, homelessness is high. And the statistical significance here is far greater than what we get with any other explanation in the book. No one's giving us a Nobel Prize for this. Okay? A related variable is vacancy rates. So according to urban economists, 5% is considered a neutral vacancy rate. Below 5% would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. Above 5% would suggest that you have sufficient rental housing. What this shows is when you get below 5%, homelessness is high. So when you put them together, rents and vacancies, if you have high rents and low vacancies, you're probably going to have a problem with homelessness. And if people get irritated with me, I will pose the question to them, give me a counterexample. Give me a place in the United States with really high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. And then I get people staring at the ceiling and thinking, and I'll say, I'll save you the time, there isn't one. So is it a perfect predictor? It's not a perfect predictor, but we don't need a perfect predictor. It's pretty darn good. It's pretty darn good. And so ultimately, if these are drivers, we should then be really concerned about the housing market conditions in our cities because it has a huge impact on Joe on the street and it has a huge impact on third grade teachers and firefighters and nurses and service workers who are trying to live in the communities that they serve, and it's not working. So why do places like Seattle have high rents and low vacancies? Is it just because of Amazon? Amazon hired a whole bunch of people. They blew up the housing market. Certainly part of the story, but what's interesting is when you plot population growth in the 2010s and rates of homelessness, what you'll see is almost no relationship, statistically speaking, which really surprised me. And I realized after running this a couple times that I hadn't messed up the data, and I went into the bubbles. I was like, what's the deal here? And I realized there are a bunch of places that are growing really fast in the United States that are not having a housing crisis. Why? Because we need to think about supply as well. So supply elasticity, if you took economics at some point in your life, you might be getting indigestion, thinking about supply elasticity. It doesn't need to be scary. It doesn't need to be scary. So if we think about this product, clickers. If the price of clickers goes up 10 times tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? The people who make these, they're going to have some champagne tonight. This is great. And then they're going to make a whole bunch of these. Very quickly, the supply of clickers will increase. That is a highly elastic product. We can go to 2 shifts, 3 shifts. We'll see a bunch of these on store shelves. If the price of housing in Bend goes up 10 times tonight, people who own housing are going to have some champagne tonight and say, this is fantastic. And then what's going to happen to the supply of housing over the next couple weeks? Nothing. Why? It's hard to build housing. I need financing, I need land, I need permits, I need supplies, labor, the whole 9 yards. So generally speaking, housing isn't a super elastic good. It takes a little while to build. We also know city to city, there's big variation in elasticity. The 2 drivers are topography, mountains and water. It's harder to build if you have mountains and water, and the regulatory environment. How easy or difficult is it to build housing? If you combine a really strict regulatory environment with challenging topography, San Francisco, California, you end up with a really, really inelastic housing market. Okay? And I'm not anti-regulation. I think there's an important role for regulation in society. I want my ground beef to be safe. Okay? I want people to live in safe housing. But it's 700 days to get a permit to build housing in San Francisco right now. Okay? People are dying in the streets. It's unacceptable. Okay? There has to be a reasonable ground between appropriate regulation and building housing that we desperately, desperately need. And that has kind of gone off the rails a little bit in some of our cities. Okay, so to orient you in terms of what it looks like around the nation, change in population on the x-axis, think about that as demand for housing. More people move there, more demand for housing. Supply elasticity, 1 is considered the neutral point for supply elasticity. Above 1 would mean you build a bunch of housing. Below 1 means you don't build much housing. So to me, the most interesting part of this graph is the upper right quadrant, that bubble up there, which is Sunbelt cities that have grown just as fast as Seattle and San Francisco, but have built a whole bunch of housing. And by building a bunch of housing, they were able to maintain vacancy rates, the numbers in parentheses are the rental market vacancy rates, at meaningfully above 5%. Now, a lot of the supply probably came through sprawl, which some people in this room might say that's not the ideal way to construct housing, and I would agree with you. But it does demonstrate that if you build the units, it can have an impact. You can accommodate growth if you build. Charlotte's done it. Dallas, Austin, et cetera. The bottom right quadrant in which we find ourselves is the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. A whole bunch of people move there, you don't build much housing, what do you end up with? Really, really, really low vacancy rates. 3% vacancy rates are terribly unhealthy. It is a sign of a housing market that's totally out of whack. Totally out of whack. And the frustrating thing about Seattle is we watched San Francisco go through their tech boom 15, 20 years ahead of us. And we patted ourselves on the back and said, well, we're not San Francisco, and now we are. And it's too late. It's too late. So what I say when I'm in Ames, Iowa, or when I'm in Kansas City, what I say is, don't repeat our mistakes. As you grow, make sure that you can accommodate this growth. Because waiting until it's a crisis, which is what we've done, it's really hard to get out of it. It's really hard to get out of it. And had we made more intentional decisions as our communities grew over the last 20 years, we'd be in a very different place. Doesn't mean all of the ills would have been solved, but it'd be a heck of a lot easier to deal with it than where we are right now. Okay, so the book went through 2019 data, got published in 22, and since then we've had a few things happen, including a global pandemic, which messed up our data on all sorts of stuff. So an obvious question for those of you sitting in the audience is, so what do we know since 2019? Does the logic of the book hold? And I joke that there's good news and bad news in the story. The good news is if you wrote the book, the logic holds. Okay? The bad news as a society is the logic holds, and it's holding for more communities. It's creeping into the interior of the country. Okay? So now we have places like Phoenix and Austin and Sacramento, Atlanta, and Denver that are experiencing the same housing market pressures and lots of homelessness. And I've been to each one of these communities, and they're freaking out. And I'll say, well, you look at what's happening to rents and vacancy rates in your community. This isn't a surprise. LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, New York, DC, Portland, these are still the big places. They continue to still have the highest rates, but other folks are catching up, unfortunately. So this is, April was a big month in terms of homelessness as we think about how our communities respond to this crisis. You all probably are familiar with the Grants Pass case, which the Supreme Court heard at the end of April. I listened to the deliberations. It was actually fascinating. It was kind of tragic, but also kind of fascinating to listen to some of these arguments. They're going to rule in June. And the conventional wisdom is that there will be some, at the federal level, we will be able to criminalize. And then this will become a state and local issue around the country after the court rules. And so what we're seeing is a lot of states and jurisdictions around the country wanting to criminalize. So in the absence of robust solutions, what do? Let's get Joe off the street. And what I say to people, I talk to a lot of business groups because of my former career. I can speak to them that listen to me. And I'll say, I understand you don't want someone urinating outside your restaurant. I totally get that. It's unacceptable. We have to do something different. But if our sole response is to arrest that person, find them, and which makes it harder for them to get a job in housing after the fact, this is just a vicious death spiral down. So Oklahoma decided that they wanted to criminalize encampments, and Representative Weaver, who I have never met, was interviewed by Heather Warlick, who I've also never met. And in the interview, the journalist asked this Representative Weaver, she must have read the book, do you think homelessness is a housing problem? And Representative Weaver said, well, do I feel like homelessness is a housing problem? It could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. Okay. So this is both a comedic and a tragic quote, right? And so even people who want to criminalize, when pushed, will concede that in fact there's a housing story here. Okay. So what are we going to do? Greg, we've spent X $100 million. The problem's gotten worse. Obviously, one, we don't know what we're doing, or these are poor investments, right? I've heard a variant of this in so many communities around the United States. The reason I don't like that argument, or I don't buy the argument, is for two reasons. One is we have a scale issue. The scale of our investments have been woefully insufficient to the scale of the crisis. HHH in LA, $1 billion, great, saved lives, did a lot of good stuff. Didn't end homelessness in LA. When I was at UCLA, I said, you got a $50 billion problem, you threw $1 billion at it, and you're pissed off that homelessness didn't end? Scale. It's a scale problem. The second issue is a lot of the money that we spend in homelessness is a response to the crisis, and it's life-saving. And the people who are working in the crisis response system and in homeless shelters are doing awesome work. We should continue to fund that, but that is a response to the crisis. It's not ending it in any way. And when we then critique the system saying, we don't know what we're doing, it's like saying ERs don't work because people are still breaking arms. That's the logic. That's the argument that we're making. We would never blame the ER for breaking arms. The goal of the ER is to fix you once you break your arm. The goal of the crisis response system is to help people get back on their feet once they face homelessness. It's not doing anything to prevent homelessness from people entering into that system. What we've not done is prioritized investments in housing upstream of all types. Market rate, workforce, affordable, supportive, the whole 9 yards. We have not done that, and as a result, what happens? People keep flowing in. We actually do a pretty good job of getting people into housing. LAHSA does an amazing job in LA. They get so many, tens of thousands of people housed, but at the same time, more people are entering. So the LA Times writes a story saying, look at this, homelessness went up in LA, and it did. It did, primarily because of the inflow. So we need to think about these investments in housing, and ultimately, we need to think as cities and communities, how are we going to create the capacity for more housing? And that's when we start talking about things like land use, and then more angry emails start to come. Okay? Who should do this, public or private? I get accused of being both a shill for corporate interest and a socialist in the same talk. Okay? I firmly believe that we need to create the environment that will allow for private developers to build. We need them to build a lot more housing. 95% of housing in the United States is unsubsidized, at least with our low-income housing protection. A lot of housing is subsidized through the home mortgage interest tax deduction, but we don't think about that as a subsidy. But if 95% are kind of unsubsidized housing units, if our nation needs 3 to 7 million housing units, which we probably do, those are kind of the range of estimates, a lot of that's going to need to be built by developers. And I want to make sure that it's easier for them to do that. We also need to acknowledge the fact that some people won't be able to access that housing, and that's just math. That doesn't need to be ideologically fraught. It's just math. And that's not socialism to suggest that we then need the government to be involved in that. If you're working full-time at the minimum wage of $20 an hour in Seattle, there's not housing for you. And to suggest that we need some type of subsidy isn't socialism, it's just dealing with a reality of life in big cities right now. So my goal with this book was to hopefully take attention away from Joe, not because we shouldn't focus on Joe, but what we do is we tend to blame people for the circumstance in which they find themselves. If I walk by Joe in the morning on my way to work, and I feel bad for Joe, but I say Joe made some poor decisions in his life, it absolves me of responsibility. If instead I see Joe's situation as a consequence of structure that I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to, it then forces me to look in the mirror and say, well, then what am I going to do? Okay? And that's scary because structural problems tend to be big. And to fix structural problems, we need structural solutions, which require resources and political will, all these things that are at times in short supply. So the final thing that I hear from people is, Greg, I believe your argument, but I don't think housing is going to help Joe. He's a mess. People have said that to me in those direct words. And I'll say the reason why I'm confident that it will work is because we've done it. As a nation, just over a decade ago, we said we don't want veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness at high rates. My dad's generation, the Vietnam generation, was grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay? And that was sort of kind of a national shame. And so both Republicans and Democrats said, let's not repeat that. So what did we do? We provided resources and we activated HUD and the VA to make sure that we provided housing and services to people who need it. And what happened? We cut veteran homelessness by 50% in 10 years. It's a huge achievement that doesn't get enough publicity. And so when people say, this doesn't work, I'll say, what are you talking about? We literally just did it. This idea about whether these housing and services whether it works or not is a foolish argument in my opinion, because we've done it. What we've not done is extended that logic to a broader population of people. If you don't scale it, you're right, it's not going to work. And these were people with lots of challenges. Do you think former veterans with PTSD have behavioral health disorders? They sure do. They sure do. And we demonstrated that with housing and supports, it can work. And the point is that there's some people who just need a little purchasing power. You just need a voucher and you're off to the races. Other people need services and housing. And so yes, just housing might not help for everyone or work for everyone, but housing plus services will in fact work. So I'm going to wrap up here and then we can do some Q&A and then I'll eventually get my glass of red wine here. But the idea here is I'm confident that we could end homelessness in my lifetime. I'm confident of that. Poverty, racism, some of these other things, those will go on beyond my time on this earth. This, if we decide to, we can end this, which is what gives me hope in this issue. Now, we can't end it if we continue to make the same decisions we've made to date. And my fear is that if we continue to operate as we have over the last 20 years, we're going to think 2024 was the glory days in terms of homelessness. We're going to look back in 10 years and say, oh my gosh, it's really, really bad. And I can say, being in Seattle for 7 years, 24 is a lot worse than 2017. This is going to continue. And so if we want a different outcome, we need to behave differently. And this feels like talking to a 3-year-old a little bit. But as a nation, as a city, if we continue to do the same damn thing over and over again, we're going to get the same result, and this problem will continue to get worse. And the fear is that when that gets worse, the response that we're going to have is going to get harsher and harsher. And what I say to people is what scares me most about this crisis is my social circle in Seattle, which is disproportionately probably Obama and Biden voters, are saying, get these people out of here. Okay? And if we lose that group of people who basically say, round them up, put them in a camp, move them to Wenatchee. They always say Wenatchee. I'm like, what did Wenatchee do? Literally, multiple people are like, why don't you send them to Wenatchee? I'm like, that's such a weird thing to say. So anyway, we need to make different decisions. If we don't, we're going to regret it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Alrighty. Yeah, we're going to start off with the Q&A. It's a fairly small crowd. If you just, raise your hands and I'll come around and give you the mic. I'll just start us off with one to get the juices flowing. Gregg, in your opinion, what are the impediments to development at the local level?
Well, how much time do we have? So here's the problem. One of the big, the local politics, you all know this, the local politics around housing are toxic, exceedingly toxic. And the problem is that we have created a system of approvals around housing development that frustrate housing development at almost every step. And we do this over and over and over, and then we say, why do we have a screwed up housing system? Why? Because when we want to build multifamily housing, we send a note to people in the neighborhood and say, hey, at 7 o'clock, we're going to have a meeting about it. Come on and tell us what you think. And who shows up at that meeting? A bunch of people who look like me, single-family homeowners who are disproportionately white and affluent, who show up and say, no. And planning commissions and city councils say, well, 6 people showed up, 6 people said no, 6-0, no multifamily housing. And we do this over and over and over. And the problem is at 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, if you've got little kids and it's bath time, you're not going. If you're working 2 jobs to afford to live in that neighborhood, you can't go. If you're not wealthy enough to even live in that neighborhood, you don't even get invited to the meeting. And this housing would benefit all of those folks who are not part of this process. So in the name of democracy, we have perverted this entire system. We have privileged people who have been privileged through multiple systems in society. So we are giving disproportionate voice to people who frankly don't need, they're doing fine. I'm doing fine. Okay? And so what we have to do is we have to think about, and there are really interesting kind of scholarly discussions around what does democracy mean in this? What does community impact mean in these conversations right now? Because the status quo can't persist. And what's fascinating, political scientists have done this work. James and I think we were talking about this earlier. I think it was with you. When you look at people's political ideology, it changes based on the unit of analysis. Same person. So the example I use is the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle, which is right next to University of Washington. Disproportionately white single-family neighborhood. Professors used to live there. If they've been here for 30 years, they can't afford it anymore. Okay. 2016 election cycle, there's a Bernie Sanders Bernie Sanders for President lawn sign, signaling their political ideology. Right next to that lawn sign was a sign for no up zones. Okay? From a political science standpoint, that is 180 degrees diametrically opposed. But political scientists have told us that people can become more conservative when it gets closer to home. And so in DC, it's go Bernie, and in my block, I don't want anything to change, small c conservative. Okay? And so if we can't get the Bernie folks to support multifamily housing, what about the other people? And so we need to acknowledge that this is a huge, huge impediment, which is why we're seeing in your state and my state more state action saying, we're going to be a little more paternalistic. We're going to say, children, cities, you've demonstrated an inability to make good choices. Right? And so we are now going to act. The problem in southern states is they're preempting in the other way. They're saying, thou shalt not upzone. So when I was in Kansas, they're like, do you have any suggestions for us? I was like, vote? I mean, the problem is like they're basically making it impossible for local jurisdictions in Kansas to create more housing capacity. So we have the advantage of at least state legislatures for the time being that are going to kind of push this, but a lot of places in the country don't have that. So this is really hard, and those of you who are doing this every day, you know this better than I do. But we have to break this down, and we have to communicate. I'll say this to people, like, if you oppose multifamily housing, you are for homelessness, and then people don't like me very much. It's true. And I live in a single-family home. Single-family homeowners aren't evil, okay? There's nothing wrong with single-family homes. The point is though, if we're going to disproportionately, if 75% of land in Seattle is zoned single-family, it doesn't work. You can't layer a massive tech boom on top of that land use and say, well, you all can live in 25% of the parcels. What's going to happen to those parcels? And that's when we end up with a really screwed up housing system. Okay, so great question.
Testing. Next. Yep.
You didn't mention Houston. Everything I've read says Houston is the poster child.
Yes, great question. Yeah, so Houston has been, in the history of homelessness, it keeps moving around the country. Houston is now the darling. New York Times wrote a big piece last year or the year before about Houston. So Houston's done a lot of really good things. Houston also has a very, very different housing market than Seattle. And so when the New York Times wrote about Houston, I got a whole bunch of emails saying, well, why don't we do this? So what did Houston do? Houston got a bunch of money from the feds, from the Obama administration after the hurricane. Which hurricane? Katrina, yeah. They used that money to fund Housing First. And Houston has an advantage, which is they have no zoning. It's a weird city, right? Single-family home, adult bookstore, bar, single-family home. Okay, but they have a lot of housing. So at the time that they got this money from the feds, they had like 8-9% vacancy rates. And so what they were able to do is use this money wisely, used Housing First, and they got people into housing and they cut homelessness by a lot. So when people said, why don't we do this in Seattle, Greg? I'll say, well, that's harder said than done. We literally have no place to put people. We could get truckfuls of money from DC, and there literally wouldn't be a place to put people. So the logic of, we can't just take the Houston playbook and make it work in Portland or Seattle or LA or New York because we have a very different housing system. Now, there are plenty of places with with accommodating housing markets that didn't do what Houston did. And so what Houston did is they had 2 mayors in a row who were really focused on this. They partnered with the nonprofit community, and they did a really good job. So they deserve a lot of credit for it because there were other places in their position that didn't do that. But the idea that we can just take Houston and apply that in Seattle is difficult. Milwaukee's done a good job. So there are other places similar, but they all have kind of advantages that our coastal cities don't have.
Thanks for your time.
Yep.
Locally, just for Bend as an example, right?
Yep.
And over the next 50 years or whatever, the population is expected to be like 175K from transplants like me. And so I know that, the city of Bend expanded their UGB, I think, in like 2016. So, I mean, like Bend has urbanized, and of course there's, I don't want to like discount the small town, like the people who miss the small town. And with that being said, I guess this is a question about land use. Mm-hmm. I mean, to go on a quick tangent, we've got like a bunch of farmers, for instance, who have a lot of land. They're thinking about retiring. They're thinking about, oh, that subdivision developer wants to buy this for a lot more money than that next farmer.
Yep.
But then you're going to lose farmland on a massive scale. So is the answer, I guess, to just like, at what point does a city start building up even more, even beyond what it's already doing? And when you do that, when you think about the workforce that's coming in, say the tourism workforce, which represents, I think, like 14% of Deschutes County, if I'm correct, how do you create, when you have, I heard this thing, if you have renters, they're not going to be on the PTO boards, they're not going to care about their community. So like when you have this rock and a hard place of like, well, we need more housing supply, but we're also going to eat up the land use, is the idea just to build up and maybe make cooperative land or ownership models, or what pathways forward are there for like maintaining that land that we really need?
Yeah. So my short answer would be yes, our cities need to be denser. And that's true in Seattle, and it's probably true in Bend. Now, the problem that we have, and so I, for whatever reason, get invited to Rotary a lot. I don't know if there are any Rotarians. Rotarians don't like me a whole lot, as it turns out. And so when I give this talk, I was at the Seattle Yacht Club giving a Rotary talk. And I sat down afterwards, and there was an older gentleman who was glaring at me. And he said, "You want to turn Seattle into New York?" Because I was making the argument that Seattle has to densify. And I said, well, I used to live in New York City, and going to 3 or 4 units per parcel in a bunch of parcels in Seattle is very different than Midtown Manhattan, right? I mean, and density can be done in really charming ways. Or some of the most charming neighborhoods I've ever been in are actually relatively dense. Walk through Boston, great neighborhoods, Philly, like awesome. And so we immediately go to, high rises and all that kind of stuff. And what was interesting, and this guy said, well, if you get your way, there won't be any kids in Seattle. And I said, well, is the implication that families only want to live in single-family homes? He said, yes. And I said, well, I lived in New York. There's strollers all over the place, right? People are procreating in New York City, I assure you. And so there is this prejudice against density because of what it has been. And I said, this is not Seattle of 1978. And I understand why you liked Seattle of 1978. That ship has sailed. What we need to then think about is, given the circumstance that we're in right now, what does Seattle need to look like? And it has to do this. It has to. And likely Bend needs to as well, but it doesn't need to be 15-story high-rises, maybe a couple of them. But you need to create more housing capacity. And when we start to talk about kind of the conflict between housing and environmentalism, which is frequently they battle. There are certain environmental provisions that do increase the cost of housing, no doubt about it. But what I always say is those two movements are more in alignment than they're not, which is being good environmental stewards and providing greater affordability, go up. You go up, less transportation, less commutes, the whole 9 yards, preserving farmland, the whole 9 yards, and it's more affordable. And so ultimately, our cities have to be more dense. And we are a global outlier in density. Even New York City, which is by far the most dense city in the United States, is nothing compared to global cities. Go to the global south, go to Asia, even go to European cities, way, way, way more density. And people are still having children and enjoying their lives. Okay? And so we have to get away from this idea that the American dream is stuck on detached single-family homes for everyone. It just doesn't. And if you want one, there will be homes for you. There will always be single-family homes for you. But we have got to structure our cities differently. And that will be a painful, I always say, it will change. Seattle will be more dense in 25 years. No doubt about it. We can do it gracefully or kicking and screaming. All evidence would suggest we're going to do the kicking and screaming route. But it's going to happen because it has to. It just has to. So, doesn't make it easy. Doesn't make it easy, but we have to. And the idea of let's just keep going out doesn't make sense to me. I talked to someone about transit. Transit's key to this. As we build rail from Everett down to Tacoma, every station area, let's have 10,000 units around every station area. Someone could work for Amazon, live in Everett, come to the city 2 days a week, and that helps our region out immensely. But it requires good land use decision. It requires being strategic before private developers come into those station areas. Like, we have to get our act together. That's a huge opportunity for our region, that if we screw it up, our great-grandkids are going to be like, what were you doing? Well, we weren't doing what we should have done. Good question.
Thanks for being here and thanks for the great talk. Has your data set looked at consumption of housing products for things other than housing, number one, and for people owning secondary homes, number two, as influences on lack of supply?
What was number one?
Using homes for other things than homes, so like short-term rentals.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Or businesses.
Yeah, so we didn't do that in the book, but there has been more research on this phenomenon, and I get this question a lot. So there's kind of two questions here. One is we've got the Airbnb short-term rental phenomenon, and then you've got the corporatization of owning homes, Blackstone buying up a bunch of single-family homes and turning them into rental product. And so my answer to the question is it depends. I actually joke with my students, first class, I always say the answer to all good questions is it depends. And by week 5, I'll ask a question and someone will go, it depends. And then everyone laughs and cheers. And so anyway, the answer to your question is it depends. In Seattle, I would argue that those arguments are kind of a scapegoat. Let's blame Blackstone and Airbnb for our problems. We could outlaw all of them tomorrow and we would still have a massive housing crisis. On the margins, it's not helping. It's not helping. Now, if in Asheville, North Carolina, and Bend, and Sun Valley, can short-term rentals have a massive impact? For sure, for sure. And so it's really, in hospitality-driven communities, this is a super, super big issue, which is why we're starting to see a lot of local communities start to regulate that activity.
It's actually not a problem in Bend. It's only 2% of our housing stock.
Okay, so it's not a problem in Bend.
And our vacancy rate
Yeah.
is 2 point something.
Yeah, you've got really low vacancy. You've got super low vacancy rates.
Less
Yeah.
than Seattle's 3.
Yeah, no, it's super, super low vacancy, and your rents are really high. But anyway, so the answer is that anything that is going to take units out of circulation is a concern, and that's a bigger problem in some places than others. Asheville, it's huge. I mean, it's a massive percentage of their rental stock, and so they're kind of scrambling right now. So yeah, so it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, maybe, I don't know how much time we have, but maybe to bring us home, if there's a way to leave us with some examples of places on the West Coast that are sort of leaning into what does it mean to be a pro-housing, community? And what does that look like? And how can we do that better? And leave us with some positive examples of, what that looks like from your perspective.
So, there aren't great examples in our coastal cities, but there are elements that I'll highlight for you. Despite its challenges, I think Mayor Bass in LA is doing a lot of really good things. And so when I talk to people around the country, frequently Mayor Bass is highlighted as someone who, in very difficult circumstances, is just doing good stuff. So her first executive directive, is that what it is? ED? Executive Directive 1 was basically a fast-track permitting measure that I keep hearing really, really good things about. Developers are saying it's not completely there, but it is allowing for development much, much more quickly, multifamily development. I think the scale of the problem overwhelms some of the good stuff they're doing in homelessness. I would say another community that's doing really good things is Denver. I think the state of Colorado and I think the city of Denver is doing really good things. Margot, my colleague from UCSF, we just wrote an op-ed about the Grants Pass case, and we highlighted Denver. What Mayor Johnston did was they had about 1,300 or 1,400 unsheltered people in the city of Denver, and Mayor Johnston did what I would call put points in the scoreboard, which was they used hotels, and they had this thing called House 1000, and they got 1,000 people off the streets into hotels. Wow. And what it didn't end homelessness because people are still in a sheltered situation, but they demonstrated that with resources and political will that they can change the city for the better. And people walk around saying, this is better. And so then when they come back next time to say, and we need to do this, they're more willing to do that. That's not what Seattle is doing. I would say we're taking points off the scoreboard in Seattle, which makes all these conversations much more difficult. And so Mayor Johnston and his team, I've talked to them, they understand they need to figure out how to get people out of hotels into permanent housing, and that's hard. But at least they took one step. So there are examples out there. I wish they were more numerous than they are. This is not a coastal city, but one of the coolest things that's happened is I've been to Kentucky 2 or 3 times now, and Andy Beshear is their governor. He was just reelected last November. And Governor Beshear spoke right before me. We have a line in the book called that says, "Homes are where jobs go at night." That actually came from the executive director of King County Housing Authority. And what Kentucky is experiencing is population growth because like Tesla's opening a plant. And so all of a sudden there's 10,000 new jobs and there's no place for people to live. And what Governor Beshear said was, we are now going to pair economic development. When we give tax breaks to a company, we're gonna then make a parallel announcement saying we're gonna also make a commitment to housing. It doesn't mean that the state or the city is gonna build all the housing. The point is that we are gonna make a public commitment to build another 7,000 units such that our population growth and our housing growth stay in line. What we didn't do in California and Oregon and Washington was we had this employment and population boom, and we just said the market will figure it out. It didn't. And now we're paying the price, and Joe's paying the price more than any of us. And so that's another example of like, why did it take so long to do that? I mean, everyone gets their suit and tie on and big scissors and shovels, and that's all about the jobs. And then we didn't say a word about the housing. And so those are some examples anyway that give me hope. Yeah. I don't know the details on it. I think probably what it is I don't know if it's a carrot or a stick. There might be some carrots in the sense that here's the state going to that community saying, here's some goodies if you will build this housing, or it might be more stick sense in this, you need to build this housing or there'll be consequences. I'm a big believer that states have not used enough goodies and carrots to incent the behavior that they want. I think that's, matching money or giving them bonuses for building the housing or the capacity that they need is really good because, I'm not opposed to sticks, but stick-only legislating is tough. And so we have to figure out how to bring people along and give some goodies in the process.
And one back here.
So you had mentioned the need to increase density in our cities. Bend we're slowly moving in that direction, but one of the big things that seems to be slowing things down is an outdated infrastructure that's based on low density, and that's an enormous amount of money to rectify. So what have you seen there for how that's been addressed?
That's a good example of, in my opinion, a carrot. So I've been working with a team on legislature on transit-oriented development along our light rail expansion. And one of the things that we were talking about was state money isn't going to be used to build housing. It might be used to buy some land, but it's also going to be used to create infrastructure. So if you want 10,000 units around that station area, here's some state money to say, here's money for sewers and curbs and all that kind of stuff, which would then allow that community to then do that and then bring developers in and say, go for it. And so that to me is a good use of state funds in my opinion, because that stuff can get expensive. But yeah, and I will say that the infrastructure argument is legitimate. It is also weaponized, right? When we hear people at meetings like, what about the schools, the capacity of the schools? What about traffic, right? This many times is code for what about, I don't want those people in my neighborhood. And so we need to be clear about when that's a legitimate concern and when it's a straw man for other biases.
Hello.
Hello.
You know this, but others don't. I've worked the last 15 years of my career on the federal effort to end veterans' homelessness. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, I was really pleased to see you called that out. But that effort has been very heavily federally driven. Yep. Very heavily. I mean, there's $3 billion plus budget between ours and HUD's just for homeless veterans, which is a fraction of the total homeless in the country. Yep. You're focusing rightly on localities here, city, county, state? What can the feds do to help?
Well, Margot and I in our op-ed said that there's a lot of things that state and localities can and should do, but without federal action, ending this will be impossible. And so that is, I wanted to end on a high note, but that is a reality. And given the impediments we have in terms of legislating at the federal level, I'm skeptical that we're going to see that, independent of where the election goes in September or in November. So we absolutely, the feds have the deepest pockets in the nation. They have to play a bigger role. 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing support in the United States get it. Federal housing support, 1 in 4. If you're eligible for food support, you get it, 4 in 4. It's an entitlement. So what happens is the feds are making life very difficult for the state of Oregon and for Deschutes County, is that your county? And the city of Bend, because 3 in 4 people are saying, I'm not getting any help from DC, and housing is the most expensive line item in my household budget, and I need help. And states and cities and counties are saying, but that's really expensive. And that's where we are right now in this mess. And so Build Back Better, there was a big proposal in the Build Back Better bill for voucher expansion. That would have been great. And is vouchers a silver bullet? No. But it helps. It gives people purchasing power, and it also helps with housing production because people know that people with vouchers will be able to pay market rents. Their income plus the voucher allows them to get market rents. It's easier to develop people who can pay market rents than people who can only afford $500 a month. So that was disappointing from a federal perspective. And so, it was actually my birth year, 1972. Nixon put a moratorium on public housing. And since that time, what we've seen is basically a steady decline by the federal government in terms of low-income housing policy, and we're seeing the results. Which was one of Gavin Newsom's counter-arguments to President Trump when he was blaming, he's like, but what about the federal government? And so anyway, there's truth. There are fingers to be pointed at all over. And this is true for both Republican and Democratic administrations. We just have not prioritized housing, and we're dealing with the consequences now.
I think we have time for probably 2 more questions. So if Rachel, did you have a question?
Hi, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you about workforce housing in particular.
Yep.
And how does that, you talked about upstream measures. I think workforce housing is an upstream measure, but how does it, do you have any information about how it directly impacts homelessness? Because we have a homeless problem.
Yep.
But we also have a workforce housing problem. Our median home prices have outpriced everyone in a working job. And even executives are hard to recruit here at this point. Our homes are so expensive.
Right.
And so what are some examples of what you can do for that? And what is that an upstream measure that will stop homelessness for our kids or expanding in the way you spoke of? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So this basically is a variant of what kind of housing should we build if we want to end this? And should we build market rate? Should we build workforce housing? Should we build supportive housing? And my answer is, if this were an exam, it's D, all the above. And here's why I answer that way. Without more production up high, we have people down renting. And so we can build a bunch of supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, but it's not going to stop people from entering. And so to a certain extent, we'd almost be chasing our tail. We have to build a bunch up top, and then we also then need to create capacity for the lowest of the low incomes. And then we need workforce housing as well. What I think we need to do politically and in terms of messaging is being really clear that the crisis that is preventing third grade teachers in Seattle from living in Seattle is the exact same crisis that's producing homelessness. The consequences are just different. The consequence for a third grade teacher is they now have an hour commute. The consequence for Joe is he's homeless. Same crisis. And so therefore we need to think about this portfolio of housing saying, let's activate housing here, here, and here. And all of that will help. And we know from research that even just market rate housing does release some of the pressure in the housing market. It won't end homelessness, but it does make the market more accessible, which is why I say one of the roles of local government is to activate the private market to build this housing. And from a political standpoint, when third grade teachers can't afford housing, it's very hard to argue against that. Republican, Democrat, I want to live in a city that has firefighters and police officers and third grade teachers and hospitality workers. You don't have that, you don't have a city. And so therefore, if those people cannot live in a city, well, we should probably have a different conversation then. And that opens up a lot of opportunities. And I was in Atlanta a couple weeks ago, and I had a chance to spend some time with Sean Donovan, who was Obama's HUD secretary. He's now CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, which is a housing developer. And he said that he's also been traveling around the country. We were comparing notes. He said he's more concerned about housing right now than at any point in his career. He ran housing in New York before he went to the federal government. And so this is a clear and present danger to the vitality of our health and vitality of our communities. And so we have to use, and what he was saying when we were chatting, he said, my old boss, he was referring to Barack Obama, said, a crisis is a terrible thing, and it's a terrible thing to waste. This is a crisis that we cannot waste. And we know when the middle class is affected, we get action. It doesn't feel great, it feels a little sleazy, but we gotta take advantage of that because it's good politics to take care of middle class folks. And if that then helps Joe too, let's do it.
We got one more. All right.
Hi, thank you. That was incredible. Are you going to update your stats?
Yeah, I am.
New book or online? Or?
Yeah, it's in process. I'm busy, unfortunately. But there will be at some point an update. And I think, and the update is going to talk about we have to talk about asylum seekers and migrants, which is kind of changing the dynamic for homelessness right now. So there's some other things that have happened since publication that are important. And I think also this idea that it's hitting many more cities. So I actually just got an email from my publisher about that. I'm like, I know. So anyway, at some point.
One more question from someone in our community who puts probably more volunteer hours than anyone here. So, David.
Thank you. As a member of the local pro-housing YIMBY group, encourage people to take a look and get involved. I had a question about messaging. Some people are extremely resistant to this stuff. Like I pulled out this statistic about West Virginia, high rates of drug use, and the guy's like, well, it has a lot of mountains though, so that's why there aren't homeless people. You've given this talk a lot, you've talked with a lot of people. What kind of messaging really gets through to people the most?
I think it kind of depends. What I've learned is there's probably 15% of people that know messaging is going to help. And initially I was trying to figure out how to get to them, and now I've just put them in my email folder. And so I'm at peace with that. But then there's this kind of movable middle where I get a lot of positive feedback. And a lot of people, like the West Virginia thing resonates for them. For a lot of people, it's the musical chairs. I've gotten more feedback on musical chairs than anything. They're like, oh, that makes sense to me. Detroit, it's like the most poverty in the United States, and they have a lot lower homelessness. That's like, I hear people. So I think it's different things for different people. And so I kind of think about like having an architecture and kind of hanging ornaments on a Christmas tree, and like you hang enough and one might resonate with someone a little bit, and it's not the same thing for everyone. And so there's a really cool group in California, I was just emailing from the plane today, called the Housing Narrative Lab. And they're doing a lot of work on this very issue in terms of how do we do a better job of changing the narrative around housing, which I think we have as a society been negligent over the last 20 years, and we're living with the consequences. So I don't think there's a silver bullet narrative, but we just got to try as many things as possible. I think the third grade teacher thing, that resonates. The other one that really works, which is selfishly motivated, is if you ever want to see your grandkids again, Seattle homeowner, you better approve some housing. Otherwise, you better start checking nonstop flights to Des Moines, because that's where they're going to live. And then people are like, oh, yeah, that's right. I have 2 kids who went to college, and they can't afford to live in Seattle, and they're going to have kids, and they're going to be in Columbus, Ohio. And so I'm not above using kind of selfish motivations to get what I want. And so that can be part of the messaging.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Gregg. That was incredible. We appreciate you. If we could give you another warm round of applause. Thank you again to our sponsors, Ashleen Vance, Polish, Hayden. We appreciate you. Build a Better Bend has 2 more lectures, one on September 12th and another on October 15th, about innovative housing and NIMBYism, how we can all come together and work together to ask for more housing and get it done. I thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you.